Some moments are forged in silence, others in fire. For billionaire titan Sterling Hayes, a man who could buy and sell entire city blocks with a single phone call, his entire world was about to be consumed by both. On a night meant to celebrate his greatest triumph in a room filled with the most influential people in the country, he chose to unleash his fury on a single invisible waitress. But he made one fatal mistake. He thought she was a nobody. He never imagined that this forgotten girl held a key to a past he had buried under a mountain of money and lies, and that she was about to use it to turn his kingdom to ash with just one perfectly aimed sentence. The air in L'Etoile d'Or wasn't just air. It was a curated atmosphere of success, thick with the scent of truffle oil, vintage leather, and the quiet, confident hum of money. Perched on the 60th floor of a skyscraper that scraped the New York City sky, the restaurant was a theater of power. And tonight the lead actor was Sterling Hayes. His face, a chiseled sculpture of ambition and impatience, was illuminated by the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of fallen stars. He wasn't just in the city. He owned a significant, glittering piece of it. Sterling was the founder and CEO of Auratech, a name synonymous with ruthless innovation. They didn't just create technology. They consumed their competitors, absorbing them into a corporate monolith that cast a long, dark shadow over Silicon Valley and Wall Street alike. Tonight was the coronation. After a brutal 6-month hostile takeover, he had finally conquered his largest rival, Helios Dynamics. It wasn't just a business deal, it was a decapitation. He hadn't just won, he had annihilated. At his table, a constellation of his inner circle orbited him. There was Kevin Lynch, his ambitious, sycophantic protege, whose eyes shone with a mixture of admiration and fear. Opposite him sat Richard Sterling, the company's veteran legal counsel, a man whose weary expression suggested he'd cleaned up one too many of Sterling's messes. A few other board members and investors filled the remaining seats, their laughter a little too loud, their praise a little too lavish. They were celebrating, but they were also performing, each one acutely aware of the volatile gravity exerted by the man at the head of the table. To Sterling, Kevin toasted, raising a glass of Chateau Margaux that cost more than the monthly rent of a dozen city apartments. The man who doesn't just see the future, he builds it and bankrupts anyone who gets in his way. A round of appreciative chuckles followed. Sterling offered a thin, predatory smile. He didn't care for the flattery, but he demanded it as his due. His gaze swept the room not with appreciation, but with the cool assessment of a conqueror surveying his domain. Every person here, from the deferential maitre d' to the banking mogul at the corner table, knew who he was. Power was his native language. It was in this atmosphere of absolute control that a young woman named Amelia Rossi moved like a ghost. She was a waitress, part of the invisible machinery that made places like this run. With her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and a plain black uniform, she was designed to be overlooked, a fleeting presence that delivered plates and refilled glasses before melting back into the periphery. She had been working at L'Etoile d'Or for 6 months, a grueling job she endured with a quiet, unnerving focus. While her colleagues chatted nervously about the high-profile guests, Amelia remained silent, her movements precise, her eyes holding a depth that seemed out of place amidst the clatter of silverware and empty pleasantries. She approached Sterling's table with a fresh bottle of the Margaux. Her hands were steady, her expression neutral. She had served him before. He never looked at her, never acknowledged her existence beyond a curt nod or an impatient wave of his hand. To him, she was not a person, she was a function. As she leaned in to pour, Kevin Lynch, emboldened by wine and victory, shifted abruptly in his chair, gesturing wildly as he told an anecdote. His elbow connected with Amelia's arm. It was a small, clumsy accident, but the consequence was immediate and catastrophic. The heavy ruby-red wine sloshed from the bottle, splashing not onto the pristine white tablecloth, but directly onto the sleeve of Sterling Hayes's custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. A collective gasp sucked the air from the table. The boisterous conversation died instantly. Kevin froze, his face paling to a ghostly white. Richard the lawyer closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if bracing for a familiar storm. The wine, dark as blood, soaked into the fine gray wool. For a moment there was only the sound of a distant siren on the streets below. Sterling didn't move. He simply stared down at his stained sleeve, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He lifted his head, and his eyes, cold and sharp as shards of ice, found Amelia's. It was the first time he had ever truly looked at her. "Are you an idiot?" he said, his voice deceptively low, yet carrying across the now silent dining room. The tables nearby, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, fell quiet. Diners pretended to study their menus, but their ears were trained on the unfolding drama. Amelia stood frozen, the bottle still in her hand. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident." "An accident?" Sterling's voice began to rise, gaining a raw, brutal edge. He pushed his chair back and stood up, the full force of his rage now on display. He was a tall man, and he used his height to tower over her, to shrink her. "An accident. This suit is worth more than you'll make in a year. This night is worth more than your entire miserable life. And you, with your incompetence, have ruined it." He wasn't just angry about the suit. The suit was a symbol. It was a crack in the perfect facade of his victory, a moment of chaos he could not control, and it had been caused by someone he considered less than nothing. The restaurant manager, a man named David, rushed over his face a mask of professional panic. "Mr. Hayes, please, my deepest apologies. We will of course cover all cleaning and tailoring costs immediately. The entire meal is on the house." Sterling didn't even glance at him. He jabbed a finger at Amelia, his face contorted in a sneer of pure contempt. "You think money fixes this? It's the principle. It's the sheer, stunning stupidity. I am surrounded by the best. I pay for the best, and I have to deal with this." He gestured vaguely at her as if she were a piece of trash that had blown in from the street. "You're fired. Get out. I don't want to see your pathetic face for another second." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, but she fought them back, her chin trembling. The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. The entire room was watching. 100 pairs of eyes, all seeing her as he saw her, small, insignificant, a failure. She was about to turn to flee the suffocating weight of his scorn and the silent judgment of the crowd. But then something shifted. Her trembling stopped. She straightened her spine. She looked past the billionaire's rage, past the expensive suit and the powerful facade, and saw the man underneath. The man she had been watching for years. The man whose name had been a curse in her home for over a decade. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the kind one takes before diving into deep, cold water. The manager was gently trying to guide her away, whispering, "Just go, please, miss." But she stood her ground. She lifted her gaze to meet Sterling's, and the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else entirely. It was a cold, hard resolve, a flame that had been banked for 15 years now roaring to life. The entire room held its breath, waiting for her to scurry away in disgrace. Instead, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, cutting through the stunned silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She said one sentence. And with that one sentence, the world of Sterling Hayes, the triumphant celebrations, the billion-dollar deals, the carefully constructed empire, came to a dead silent halt. The sentence that left Amelia Rossi's lips was not a plea for her job, nor an apology, nor a curse. It was a key unlocking a door to a room in Sterling Hayes's past that he had bricked over, plastered, and pretended didn't exist. He always said a man's worth is measured by his legacy, not his balance sheet. She said, her voice steady and clear. "What do you think Robert would say about your Sterling?" The effect was instantaneous and profound. It wasn't like a bomb going off. It was like the instant after the vacuum of sound and air, the ringing silence where a world used to be. The name Robert hung in the air, meaningless to everyone else in the room. But to Sterling Hayes it was a ghost story, a name he hadn't heard spoken to his face in 15 years. And the use of his first name, Sterling, was a shocking, intimate act of defiance. No one but his closest peers dared to be so familiar. The rage on his face didn't just vanish, it collapsed. It was as if the internal scaffolding holding up his fury had been kicked out from under him. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen under the restaurant's soft lighting. His mouth, which moments before had been spewing venom, hung slightly open. The hand that had been pointing at her fell to his side, not in a gesture of calm, but like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His eyes, which had been burning with contempt, were now wide with a dawning, horrifying recognition. He looked at her again, truly looked at her, and for the first time he saw past the waitress uniform. He saw the shape of her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. He saw a face he hadn't seen since it was that of a child, a face that belonged to the past he had so violently erased. The room remained utterly still. Kevin Lynch looked from Sterling to Amelia, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Robert? Who's Robert?" he whispered, but his voice sounded like a shout in the stillness. Richard the lawyer, however, did not look confused. A flicker of deep unease crossed his features. He remembered the name. He remembered the ugly, brutal acquisition that had been one of the first foundation stones of Sterling's empire. He remembered the man named Robert Rossi. The other diners were a gallery of frozen expressions. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the impact. They had just witnessed a shepherd's boy fell a Goliath, not with a stone, but with a whisper. They saw a king stripped of his crown in his own court, and they could not look away. Amelia did not flinch under his shocked gaze. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, playing out every possible reaction. His anger, his denial, his threats. But she had never quite prepared for this, the complete and utter demolition of his composure. The sight of his raw, unguarded shock gave her a surge of strength. The manager David was caught in the crossfire, his instincts telling him to remove her, but the sheer gravity of the moment paralyzed him. "Miss," he started weakly. "I think you should—" "Quiet," Sterling rasped. The word was a dry husk, nothing like his earlier booming commands. His eyes were still locked on Amelia's. "Who are you?" he demanded, though the question was a formality. He already knew. The ghost had a face. "You know who I am," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "You just chose to forget, just like you chose to forget everything you did to him, to my father." My father. The confirmation landed like a physical blow. Sterling visibly staggered, taking a half-step back as if to put distance between himself and the truth she represented. His carefully controlled universe, governed by numbers, contracts, and intimidation, had just been invaded by something far more potent, a memory with a name and a face. Richard Sterling, the lawyer, finally moved. He stood up and placed a hand on Sterling's arm. "Sterling, let's go. This isn't the place." But Sterling shrugged him off, his mind racing, trying to recalibrate to regain control. His first instinct, the one that had served him his whole life, was to attack, to discredit. "Your father was a failed businessman who couldn't compete." He snarled, but the words lacked their earlier conviction. They sounded hollow, defensive. "You're just some bitter girl looking for a payout. Is that it? You got yourself a job here just to stage this little piece of theater. How much do you want?" It was a mistake. The accusation of greed, of pettiness, only served to fuel the cold fire in Amelia's eyes. "You think this is about money?" she asked, a bitter, incredulous laugh escaping her lips. "The money you stole wouldn't be enough. You built your empire on the ashes of my family, on the grave of my father. You took everything from us and you celebrated it. You're celebrating it right now." She gestured to the lavish table, the expensive wine, the triumphant sycophants. "This victory, this Helios deal, it's just another headstone in the cemetery you call a career." Her words were no longer just a sentence. They were an indictment delivered to a silent, captive jury. The story was beginning to piece itself together in the minds of the onlookers. This wasn't a random outburst. This was a reckoning. Sterling stood there exposed and disarmed. All his weapons, his wealth, his status, his intimidating presence were useless. She wasn't an employee he could fire or a competitor he could crush. She was a consequence. She was the bill for a debt he thought he'd never have to pay finally come due. Without another word, Amelia turned. She placed the wine bottle carefully on a nearby service stand, her movements no longer those of a nervous waitress, but of someone who had completed a difficult, long-awaited task. She walked not towards the kitchens, but towards the main exit, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't run. She retreated with the dignity of a victor leaving the field of battle. The entire room watched her go. As she passed through the ornate doors and disappeared, it was as if a spell was broken. A low murmur rippled through the restaurant. Sterling Hayes remained frozen in place, the dark stain on his sleeve a perfect mirror for the indelible stain she had just revealed on his soul. The celebration was over. The feast had turned to ash in his mouth. He was still a billionaire, still one of the most powerful men in the world, but in that moment, under the shocked and curious gazes of his peers, he had never looked so small. The king was alone in his castle, haunted by a ghost in a waitress's uniform. 15 years earlier, the world had been a different place for 10-year-old Amelia Rossi. Her world was not a glittering skyscraper, but a rambling suburban house with a tire swing in the backyard and a basement that smelled of solder and ozone. That basement was her father's kingdom. Robert Rossi was not a billionaire titan. He was a brilliant, gentle-hearted engineer, a man whose mind hummed with schematics and possibilities. His company, Rossi Innovations, was small, just a handful of dedicated employees, but it was on the cusp of something revolutionary. Robert had poured a decade of his life into developing a new kind of data compression algorithm. He called it Chrysalis. It was elegant, impossibly efficient, and years ahead of its time. It had the potential to change everything from data storage to telecommunications. For Robert, Chrysalis wasn't just a product. It was a piece of his soul, a beautiful, complex puzzle he had solved for the betterment of technology. He wasn't driven by greed, but by the pure joy of creation. He would explain it to Amelia using analogies of fireflies in a jar, showing her how he could fit more light into a smaller space without crushing a single one. Rossi Innovations was a family. The employees shared potluck lunches in the small office park building they rented. Robert knew the names of their spouses, their children, their dogs. He fostered an environment of collaboration and mutual respect, a stark contrast to the cutthroat corporate world that existed just a few miles away. And it was this world that was about to come crashing into theirs. Sterling Hayes was back then a name few people knew. He was a young, ferociously ambitious corporate raider, the head of a fledgling investment firm he called Oratech. He didn't create things, he acquired them. He saw the world not as a place of innovation, but as a chessboard of assets and liabilities. He hunted for undervalued companies with breakthrough potential, not to nurture them, but to strip them for parts or absorb their intellectual property. He discovered Chrysalis through an industry paper, and his eyes, which saw everything in terms of its monetary value, lit up. He didn't see the elegance or the years of painstaking work. He saw a key that could unlock billions. His first offer was insultingly low. Robert Rossi, along with his small board of investors, politely declined. They believed in the long-term vision of the company. They wanted to grow it themselves to maintain the integrity of their creation. Sterling's second offer was only marginally better, and it came with a friendly warning. "The market is a rough place for a small fish, Robert," he'd said in a phone call, his voice dripping with condescending concern. "A shark like me can offer protection." Robert, ever the idealist, refused again. He believed his work would speak for itself. He believed in fair play. He did not understand that Sterling Hayes did not play by any rules but his own. That was when the war began. Sterling initiated a hostile takeover. He started by buying up any available shares using shell corporations to mask his activity. He then launched a smear campaign, planting articles in financial blogs and trade publications that questioned the stability and security of the Chrysalis algorithm. He bribed a junior engineer at Rossi Innovations to leak a slightly flawed early version of the code, which Oratech's own engineers then publicly exposed as vulnerable, creating a panic among potential investors and clients. Robert Rossi was an engineer, not a corporate warrior. He was baffled and horrified. He spent his days trying to fight a war of whispers and lies, a battle for which he was completely unequipped. He'd mortgage his house to buy back shares to hire lawyers who were quickly outmaneuvered and outspent by Sterling's legal army, led by a young, ruthless Richard Sterling. The potluck lunches stopped. The atmosphere in the office grew thick with fear and uncertainty. Amelia watched her father wither. The light in his eyes, the one that shone so brightly when he spoke of his work, began to dim. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. The joyful humming from the basement ceased. He would sit at the dinner table staring at his food, his mind 1,000 miles away, lost in a maze of legal documents and financial spreadsheets he barely understood. Her mother Laura tried to be the rock, but she too was cracking under the pressure. The whispered late-night arguments, the mounting pile of bills, the constant threat of losing everything, it was a poison seeping into the foundations of their home. The final blow was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty. Sterling found a loophole in the company's founding charter related to a patent filing technicality. It was a tiny, insignificant error, but in the hands of Richard's legal team, it became a fatal flaw. They used it to challenge the very ownership of the chrysalis patent, locking the company in a legal battle so expensive and protracted that it was designed to be unwinnable for a small entity. Checkmate. Bankrupt and buried in legal fees, Robert Rossi was forced to sell. Sterling Hayes bought the company, its patents, and all its assets for a fraction of its true worth. The day the deal was signed, Sterling fired everyone. Rossi Innovations was dissolved. The family was evicted from the building that same week. Amelia would never forget the day they lost their home. She sat on the tire swing in the backyard, watching men from the bank carry their furniture out to a truck. She saw her father standing by the window of his now empty study, a hollowed-out man, a ghost in his own life. He wasn't just defeated, he was erased. His life's work now belonged to the man who had destroyed him. Oratech absorbed the chrysalis algorithm, renamed it Synapse, and it became the foundational technology that propelled the company into the stratosphere. Sterling Hayes became a tech mogul. Robert Rossi became a footnote, and then, not even that. The shame and the stress were a cancer on Robert's heart. 6 months after losing his company, he suffered a massive coronary. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. He was 45 years old. Amelia's world didn't just change, it ended. Her mother, broken by grief, took a series of low-paying jobs to keep them afloat. They moved into a cramped apartment in a rundown part of town. The memory of their old life, of the house with the tire swing and the magical basement, became a painful, distant dream. But Amelia never forgot. Through her teenage years, while other kids were focused on school dances and friendships, she nursed a cold, patient anger. She read every article she could find about Sterling Hayes. She watched his ascent from a distance, seeing his face on the cover of magazines celebrated as a visionary, a genius. Every mention of Oratech's Synapse core technology was a knife in her heart. He hadn't just stolen a company, he had stolen her father's legacy, his name, his very life. And the world had applauded him for it. She knew she could never fight him in his world of money and law. So she decided to wait to watch and to find a way to fight him in her own. When she was old enough, she moved to New York City. She didn't have a grand, intricate plan. She just knew she had to get close. She worked a series of dead-end jobs, scraping by until she saw a job posting for a waitress at L'Etoile d'Or. She knew it was his favorite restaurant, a place he frequented to celebrate his kills. It took her months to get hired. Once there, she was the perfect employee, diligent, silent, invisible. She learned his habits, his favorite table, his drink of choice. She waited for the right moment, a moment of supreme arrogance, of ultimate triumph. The night of the Helios Dynamics celebration was that moment. When Kevin Lynch's elbow bumped her arm, it wasn't part of the plan, but fate had provided her the perfect opening. As she stood there facing his fury, she wasn't just a humiliated waitress. She was the 10-year-old girl on the tire swing, the daughter of a brilliant broken man. She was Robert Rossi's legacy, and she was finally ready to speak. The fallout from Amelia's public indictment began the moment she walked out of L'Etoile d'Or. Sterling's dinner party disintegrated. The board members and investors, smelling the stink of a scandal that could taint their own reputations, made hurried, awkward excuses and melted away into the night. They offered hollow sympathies about his suit, but their eyes were filled with a new, calculating curiosity. Power abhors a vacuum, and they had just witnessed a significant crack in Sterling's impenetrable armor. Soon only Kevin and Richard remained at the table, a tableau of confusion and concern. Kevin, ever the sycophant, was sputtering. "Who was that woman, sir? We can have security find her. We can sue her for slander, for harassment." Sterling didn't hear him. He had sunk back into his chair, his hands gripping the arms of the seat, his knuckles white. He was staring at the doorway Amelia had disappeared through, as if he could still see her ghost standing there. Robert Rossi. The name echoed in his mind, dredging up memories he had long since buried under layers of success and willful amnesia. He remembered the earnest, bespectacled engineer, the desperate phone calls, the look of utter devastation on the man's face in their final brutal legal meeting. He had categorized it all under cost of business, a necessary casualty on his climb to the top. He had never considered the possibility that casualties have children, and that those children grow up. "Get me my car," he rasped at Kevin, his voice still hoarse. "But the dinner is over." Sterling snapped, a flicker of his old fire returning. He shoved his chair back and strode out of the restaurant, ignoring the manager's frantic apologies and the lingering stares of the other patrons. Richard followed grimly, his legal mind already cataloging the potential damage. The ride down the elevator was silent and suffocating. When they reached the marble lobby, Sterling turned on his lawyer. "Did you know about this? Did you know he had a daughter?" Richard adjusted his glasses, his expression weary. "Sterling, the Rossi Innovations acquisition was 15 years ago. She would have been a child. There was no reason for her to be on our radar. We vetted Robert Rossi, not his entire family tree." "Find her," Sterling commanded as his limousine pulled up to the curb. "I want to know everything. Where she lives, where she works. Obviously, we know that who she talks to, what she eats for breakfast. Everything. And find out what she wants." "I have a feeling it's not money," Richard said quietly, but Sterling was already climbing into the car. He was right. Amelia wasn't looking for a payoff. When she left the restaurant, she didn't feel triumphant, only a profound, hollow emptiness. The moment she had built up in her mind for half her life was over. She had faced the monster. She had spoken her truth, but her father was still gone. Her family was still broken. She walked for hours through the city streets, the adrenaline slowly draining away, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. Sterling Hayes was not a man who would let such a public humiliation go unanswered. She had poked the most dangerous animal in the zoo. Now she had to wait for it to bite back. The next day she was formally fired from L'Etoile d'Or via a curt phone call. She had expected it. What she hadn't expected was the black sedan parked across the street from her small fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Queens. It was discreet, but to her it was as obvious as a lighthouse beacon. They were watching her. 2 days later, the first overture came. Richard Sterling appeared at her doorstep, impeccably dressed and carrying a slim leather briefcase. He was polite, almost paternal, a stark contrast to his employer's volcanic temper. "Miss Rossi," he began after she reluctantly let him in. He surveyed her tiny, clean apartment with a practiced, unreadable expression. "I am here on behalf of Mr. Hayes. He regrets the scene at the restaurant." "He regrets getting called out in front of his friends, you mean?" Amelia corrected, her arms crossed over her chest. Richard didn't argue the point. "He understands that you hold a certain grievance regarding your father's company." He is prepared to offer you a settlement, a significant one, enough to ensure you never have to work again. All it requires is your signature on a non-disclosure agreement. He slid a folder from his briefcase onto her small coffee table. Amelia didn't even look at it. "Tell him to keep his blood money," she said, her voice trembling slightly with renewed anger. "Tell him there isn't enough money in the world to buy my silence. This was never about a payout." "Then what is it about Miss Rossi?" Richard asked, his voice genuinely curious. "Revenge. It's a hollow pursuit. It won't bring your father back. It will only succeed in destroying your own life. You have no idea what you're up against. Sterling Hayes is not a man you fight and walk away from." "I'm not trying to walk away," she replied. "I'm trying to make him stand for what he did. People should know how Oratech was built. They should know the real story behind your Synapse core technology." Richard's professional calm finally cracked. A shadow of alarm crossed his face. "That is a dangerous accusation. The acquisition of Rossi Innovations was perfectly legal. Every document was signed, every transaction vetted." "Legal doesn't mean right," Amelia shot back. "And I think you and I both know that the tactics used to force my father into that legal transaction were anything but ethical. The smear campaign, the stolen code, the patent fraud. Does any of that ring a bell, Mr. Sterling?" The lawyer's face went rigid. She knew. This wasn't just an emotional outburst from a grieving daughter. She knew specifics. This was far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "These are baseless allegations," he said stiffly, his tone shifting from conciliatory to threatening. "If you attempt to make them public, Oratech's legal team will bury you in litigation so deep you'll never see the light of day. We will protect our reputation, and we have infinitely more resources than you do." "I don't need resources," Amelia said, looking him straight in the eye. "I have the truth. Now please get out of my apartment." After a long, tense moment, Richard nodded curtly. He picked up the folder and left. As soon as the door closed, Amelia's knees felt weak and she sank onto her couch. The threat was real. She had the truth, but what good was it? It was her word against a billionaire's. She had no proof, no documents, nothing but the painful stories her father had told her. She had fired her only shot, and now his army was turning its cannons on her. The black sedan was still outside. The walls of her small apartment suddenly felt like they were closing in. For the first time, she felt a profound sense of hopelessness. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe she had just signed a warrant for her own destruction. The pressure mounted relentlessly over the next week. The black sedan became a constant fixture. Her landlord suddenly started finding issues with her tenancy, threatening eviction over trivialities. A prospective job she'd interviewed for, which had seemed like a sure thing, sent a curt rejection email. Her digital life felt violated. Passwords she'd used for years suddenly stopped working. It was a silent, suffocating siege designed to isolate and break her. Sterling Hayes was demonstrating his power, showing her that his reach extended into every corner of her life. Amelia was on the verge of despair, huddled in her apartment, feeling the full weight of her decision. She had known this would be a fight, but she hadn't anticipated the insidious psychological nature of the attack. She was truly alone. That was when the email arrived. It was from an encrypted anonymous address, and the subject line was a single word: chrysalis. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She clicked it open. The message was brief. "They called me a crank for years. Maybe they were right, but I never forgot Robert Rossi. I believe you. If you want the proof to back up your truth, meet me. Midnight, Bryant Park by the Gertrude Stein statue. Come alone." There was no signature. Amelia was torn between hope and terror. It could be a trap, a lure sent by Sterling's men to get her out in the open. But the mention of chrysalis and the weary, beleaguered tone of the message felt authentic. She had nothing left to lose. The war had already come to her doorstep. Hiding would not win it. That night, under a sliver of a moon, she walked into the quiet, lamp-lit expanse of Bryant Park. The city's roar was muted here, the atmosphere tense and still. She found the statue of the famous writer, a solid, brooding presence in the dark. A man sat on the bench beside it, hunched inside a worn tweed coat, despite the mild autumn air. He looked up as she approached. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a face that seemed etched with a permanent skepticism. His hair was a messy shock of gray, and he had the tired, bloodshot eyes of someone who had spent too many nights staring at a screen or the bottom of a glass. "You're the girl from the restaurant," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was gravelly laced with the rasp of a long-time smoker. "You've got his eyes. Roberts." "Who are you?" Amelia asked, her voice cautious. "The name's Arthur Finch," he said, offering a wry, mirthless smile. "I used to be a journalist, an investigative one, if you can believe it. Now I mostly just investigate the bottom of a bottle of bourbon." He patted a beat-up leather satchel resting on the bench beside him. 15 years ago, I was working for the Financial Chronicle. I was the only reporter who thought the Auratech takeover of Rossi Innovations smelled rotten. Everyone else was writing puff pieces about the genius of Sterling Hayes. I started digging. He looked at her, his gaze sharp and appraising. "Your father, Robert," he spoke to me, off the record. He was scared, but he was a fighter. He gave me documents. Internal memos, early drafts of patents emails. He showed me how Sterling was manipulating the market, how he was creating a false narrative to devalue the company before swallowing it whole. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "Proof you have proof." "I did," Arthur said, his face clouding over. "I had the story of a lifetime. A real David and Goliath piece. I wrote it. It was explosive. It would have stopped Sterling in his tracks, maybe even landed him in front of the SEC. He paused, his gaze drifting to the distant glittering tower of the Auratech building. "The night before it was supposed to go to print, my editor killed it. He told me the paper's owners had received a call, directly from Sterling Hayes. They were threatening to pull all their advertising to launch a lawsuit that would bankrupt the paper. The owners folded. They chose money over truth." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "But Sterling didn't stop there. He didn't just want the story killed. He wanted me killed professionally. He had his people dig into my life. They found a mistake I'd made years earlier, a source I'd misquoted. They blew it up, twisted it, and fed it to a rival paper. I was publicly discredited, accused of fabricating sources. I was fired, blacklisted. No one would hire me. In the space of a week, I went from being a respected journalist to a pariah, a conspiracy theorist." He looked down at his worn shoes. "After your father died, I lost my nerve. I had a wife and kid to think about. I had copies of the files, but I was scared. Sterling had won. He'd proven he could crush anyone. So I buried it. I buried the story, I buried my career, and I tried to forget." He finally looked up, and in his tired eyes, Amelia saw a flicker of the man he used to be. "And I've been living with the shame of it ever since. Every time I see his smug face on TV, I feel it." Then I read about what happened at L'Etoile d'Or. It was a small news item, a gossip column piece about a billionaire's tantrum. But they mentioned your name, Rossi. I knew it had to be you. You did what I was too afraid to do. You stood up to him. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a thick, worn manila folder held together by a fraying rubber band. He held it out to her. "This is everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Copies of the original documents your father gave me, my notes from my interviews with him, a recorded phone call with the engineer Sterling bribed who later confessed to me out of guilt. It's the whole rotten story, Amelia. The proof you need." Amelia took the folder, her hands trembling. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with 15 years of injustice, shame, and buried truth. She opened it, and under the dim park light, she saw her father's familiar handwriting on a memo, the letterhead of Rossi Innovations, the technical diagrams for Chrysalis. It was like seeing a ghost. Tears streamed down her face, tears of grief, and for the first time in a long time, tears of hope. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why help me now?" Arthur Finch looked at her, a long-lost fire rekindling in his eyes. "Because your father was a good man who deserved better. And because you kid, you've given a cynical old ghost a reason to believe in fighting again. Sterling Hayes buried both of us once. He's not going to do it a second time. Not while we're fighting together." In the quiet solitude of the park surrounded by the sleeping city, a powerful and unlikely alliance was forged. The daughter with the righteous cause, and the disgraced journalist with the evidence. They didn't have Sterling's money or his power, but they now had something far more dangerous, the complete, verifiable truth. And a plan was beginning to form. The discovery of Arthur Finch and his treasure trove of evidence transformed the battle. Amelia was no longer a lone voice crying in the wilderness. She was an armed combatant. She and Arthur spent the next few days in his cluttered, book-filled apartment, a dusty archive of a life derailed. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, stale coffee, and renewed purpose. They meticulously went through every document in the folder. Arthur, rediscovering the instincts that had once made him a great journalist, laid out the entire narrative of Sterling's corporate malfeasance. There were emails from shell corporations showing a coordinated stock manipulation. There was a sworn affidavit never filed from a former Rossi Innovations board member detailing Sterling's threats. And most damning of all, there was the audio file of the bribed engineer, his voice trembling as he confessed to leaking the sabotaged code in exchange for a payoff from Oratech. "This is the cannon," Arthur said, tapping the small, old-school digital recorder. "Everything else is the gunpowder. This is the spark." While they plotted, Sterling Hayes was growing increasingly agitated. The report from Richard about his meeting with Amelia had been alarming. The girl wasn't just emotional, she was specific. She knew things no one should know. His initial strategy, intimidation, and a buyout had failed spectacularly. Now he was moving on to his next phase, scorched earth. "I don't care what it takes," he bellowed at Richard over the phone from his penthouse office. The city spread out beneath him like a conquered map. "Dig into her life. I want every mistake she's ever made, every late bill, every bad report card. If there's no dirt, create it. I want her so thoroughly discredited that if she so much as accuses me of jaywalking, no one will believe her. And find out who she's talking to. She's not smart enough to have gotten this far on her own." His security teams, comprised of ex-Mossad and former federal agents, intensified their surveillance. They were no longer just watching, they were actively probing. They hacked her email, tapped her phone, and tried to piece together her network. But Arthur was old school. He and Amelia communicated using burner phones, met in random crowded locations, and kept the physical evidence constantly on the move, never in the same place for more than a few hours. The real pressure point for Sterling, however, was time. The finalization of the Helios Dynamics acquisition, the very deal he had been celebrating, was just a week away. It was to be his crowning achievement, a merger that would make Oratech a near monopoly. The deal was set to be announced at a massive press conference, a media extravaganza designed to showcase his ultimate victory. Any hint of a major scandal, especially one involving the fraudulent origins of Oratech's core technology, could spook the Helios shareholders and the federal regulators overseeing the merger. The entire multi-billion-dollar deal could collapse. Sterling felt the walls closing in. He was a man accustomed to being the hunter, and he was not comfortable being the prey. His paranoia grew, his infamous temper becoming even more volatile. He tore into his subordinates for the slightest infractions, creating an atmosphere of terror at Oratech headquarters. He became obsessed with the ghost of Robert Rossi. He had his team pull every file on the old acquisition, and as he read through the aggressive predatory tactics he had used, he wasn't filled with remorse but with a cold fury that his past was refusing to stay dead. One afternoon, Richard entered Sterling's office with a grave expression. "We have a problem. The surveillance picked up a meeting. Amelia Rossi and a man named Arthur Finch." Sterling's blood ran cold. He remembered the name. The muckraking reporter. The pest he had swatted and crushed 15 years ago. Finch. He whispered the name, tasting like acid. "He's alive. I thought he was a washed-up drunk." "He is," Richard confirmed. "But it seems your waitress has inspired him to sober up. If Finch is involved, this is no longer just a personal vendetta. He knows the playbook. He'll be looking for a media outlet, a way to make this public. And he might still have his old files. The ticking clock in Sterling's head grew deafeningly loud. The press conference was in 3 days. He had to assume they were planning to use it as their stage to inflict maximum damage at his moment of maximum glory. "Then we end this now," Sterling declared, his eyes glinting with a chilling resolve. He picked up his phone and dialed a number not from his corporate directory but from a small encrypted device he kept locked in his desk. He was calling in a favor from a man who specialized in problems that couldn't be solved with lawyers. A man who operated in the deepest, darkest shadows of the corporate world. "I have a situation," Sterling said into the phone, his voice low and dangerous. "2 people. A girl and an old reporter. I need them silenced. Permanently." He wasn't talking about litigation anymore. The game had changed. It was no longer about money or reputation. It was about survival. For Amelia and Arthur, the fight for justice had just become a fight for their lives. The next 72 hours would not just determine the fate of an empire, but whether they would even live to see the dawn. The grand ballroom of the New York Plaza Hotel was a theater of corporate worship. Hundreds of journalists crammed together their cameras aimed at a gleaming stage where the logos of Oratech and Helios Dynamics were intertwined on a massive screen. This was the pinnacle of Sterling Hayes' career, the press conference announcing his greatest conquest. Backstage, he adjusted his cuffs, a smirk of pure victory on his face. An hour earlier, his fixer had confirmed that the problem was solved. Arthur Finch's apartment had suffered a small accidental fire, and Amelia Rossi had been firmly encouraged to disappear. He was untouchable. He had fatally underestimated his opponents. 2 days earlier, a cryptic warning from one of Arthur's old contacts had sent them underground. Anticipating Sterling's violent move, they secured the original evidence in a bank vault and executed their desperate final plan. Arthur had called in a life-defining favor with a young, ambitious tech blogger, convincing her to lend them her press credentials in exchange for the scoop of the century. Now, lost in the sea of faces, Amelia and Arthur looked like any other reporters, a USB drive in Arthur's pocket, holding the weapon that would start a war. The lights dimmed. After a glowing introduction, Sterling Hayes strode onto the stage to a blinding storm of camera flashes. He was a king surveying his domain. He began his speech, his voice resonant with power and false humility. "Today is not just a victory for Oratech," he declared. "It is a victory for innovation. We are building the future, a future powered by groundbreaking technology like our patented Synapse Core." As he spoke, Arthur created a small diversion, loudly arguing with a security guard. In that moment of distraction, Amelia slipped away, moving with the practiced invisibility of her former profession. She navigated the edge of the room to the unguarded tech booth where a young technician was managing the presentation feeds. "Excuse me," she said, holding up her borrowed credentials. "Sarah Jenkins from TechPulse. My editor sent an updated graphic. I was told to give it to you directly." She handed him the USB drive. The harried technician, focused on the live event, didn't give it a second thought. "Write the synergy slide," he mumbled, plugging it into his console. "Which file? It's called Legacy." Amelia replied, her voice a near whisper. On stage, Sterling was hitting his triumphant climax. The foundation of this company was built on integrity, on a relentless pursuit of excellence, and it is on that foundation that we will build the world of tomorrow. In the booth, the technician clicked the file. It wasn't a slide. An audio player appeared. Before he could process the error, Amelia lunged forward, slamming the play button and cranking the ballroom's master audio feed to its maximum volume. The smooth corporate music was instantly replaced by a man's trembling voice, amplified to fill every corner of the vast room. My name is Daniel Finch. I was a junior engineer at Rossi Innovations. He paid me. Sterling Hayes. He paid me $10,000 to leak a corrupted version of the Chrysalis code. Sterling froze mid-sentence, his face instantly draining of all color. The confident smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. The voice from the past continued its confession, an electronic ghost screaming in his machine. He knew Robert Rossi couldn't survive the bad press. He told me it was just business. But it wasn't. It was theft. I watched him destroy a good man. As the confession echoed, the screen behind Sterling flickered. The corporate logos were replaced by scanned documents flashing in a horrifying sequence. Robert Rossi's desperate memos, the fraudulent patent challenges, the threatening letters from Sterling's legal team. The entire sordid history of his first great crime was now on public display. The room, silent for a stunned second, erupted into chaos. Reporters leaped to their feet, shouting questions. Camera flashes went off like a sustained lightning strike. The Helios Dynamics partners in the front row stared at Sterling with cold fury before standing up and walking out the multi-billion-dollar deal, dying before the world's eyes. Sterling stood paralyzed in the spotlight, utterly exposed. His eyes scanned the chaotic room and found her. Amelia stood by the tech booth, her face illuminated by the glow of the evidence destroying him. In her calm, steady gaze, he didn't see a waitress or a vengeful girl. He saw the face of his own legacy, the truth. Security guards finally reached Amelia and Arthur, but it was too late. The story was already broadcasting live across the globe. Arthur was smiling, a look of profound, long overdue peace on his face. As they were led away, the last thing Amelia saw was Sterling Hayes alone on his grand stage, a fallen king surrounded by the ruins of his empire, forever defined not by his victory, but by his sin. That day, the world learned the real story behind Aura Tech's success. The Helios deal collapsed spectacularly. Federal investigations were launched, and Sterling Hayes was ultimately forced to step down in disgrace, facing a barrage of lawsuits that would dismantle the empire he had built. He lost everything, not in a boardroom, but in a flash of public truth delivered by the woman he had dismissed as a nobody. Amelia Rossi never sought the spotlight again. With the truth finally revealed, she used the money from a class action lawsuit filed by former Rossi Innovations employees to start a foundation in her father's name, one that funded brilliant, ethical young engineers. This story is a powerful reminder that every person we meet, no matter their station in life, has a story. It teaches us that true power isn't measured by wealth or status, but by integrity and truth. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the most powerful. Sometimes the most world-changing force can be a quiet, steady whisper of truth spoken by someone who has nothing left to lose. If this story resonated with you and you believe in the power of truth to overcome tyranny, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with others who need to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the incredible strength of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.